A warm welcome to today's video, which will be explaining utilitarianism for philosophy A level. This video will give you all the details that you need to get the top marks. Now, Bentham's utilitarianism is what we will explore first. There we go. Now, there are lots of different terms for the same theory. Lots of different terms. And the exam board, they're going to try and trick you out. Honestly, I mean, the reality is one of the ways they're going to distinguish between the students who are going to get D's and C's compared to the students who get A stars, they're going to use difficult terms to try and trick people out. Because if people haven't done enough work and they don't know all the different terms that they might use, that's where they'll get you. And that's where the top students just pull away from everyone else. Because they understand that Bentham's utilitarianism is the same as quantitative utilitarianism, which is the same as hedonistic utilitarianism. We have so many different terms for the same idea. And we can actually use these terms, although they do all mean slightly different things, we can use them interchangeably. Now, Bentham notices a fact of human nature. He notices that we have two sovereign masters, two things which govern the human experience. The first one is pleasure. We try and maximise pleasure. And the second one is pain. We try and minimise pain. Now, these two are extremely evident. They're almost self-evident and impossible to deny. You know, you put your hand on a stove and you're going to try and minimise pain. That's just a fact of nature. Now, he takes an is about the world. This sovereign master's is the way the world works. And what he does is he turns it to an ought. He says, this is the world works, and this is also how we should govern morality. Because these two things are true, let's work from these two things that we know are true. Bentham argued an ethical act is one which maximises pleasure. And that's why we mean hedonic. An act which maximises pleasure. Pleasure is the most important variable in ethics, in morality. And we should maximise it for the most amount of people for the longest duration. So what we should aim at is general happiness. Happiness by minimising pleasure and maximising pain, working from the two sovereign masters. And if we do that, we'll have a moral society. Now, the most important thing is the quantity of pleasure. We want the most amount of people for the most amount of time and the most amount of pleasure possible. And that's why we also refer to this theory as quantitative utilitarianism, because it's all about the quantity of pleasure, how much pleasure. If an act might give someone a little bit of pleasure and a different act might give a lot of people lots of pleasure, which one's the better act? Simple, right? Now, this is a key definition we need to know. It's also about commensurability. Now, this is just basically equality. So, different pleasures are just of equal moral value. And this is where we get this idea that pushpin is equal to poetry, or TikTok is equal to, anything else, Van Gogh or whatever. All pleasures are ultimately equal. And we can now, in contemporary neuroscience, we can maybe, not a neuroscientist, we can maybe also validate this, because it's all just chemicals in the brain. And so the chemicals that you get from a TikTok video, the dopamine, for example, may be just the same process that you might get from any other type of pleasure. And so pushpin is equal to poetry. Now, we also need to work out, if we agree that a moral act is one that maximises pleasure, the question then becomes, well, how do we know what causes pleasure? Pleasure is quite a difficult thing to try and predict. And so how do we know whether we're doing the right thing? Well, we have 7 steps to know whether an act is going to, before we do it, maximise pleasure, maximise happiness. And this is the, I struggle with this word, philosophic, or we can also term it as the hedonic calculus from Bentham. We have these 7 variables, and we need to try and maximise each one of them. An act that does lots of these, it's near, it's intense, it will last a long time, it will impact a lot of people, it's likely to do these things, it's going to not be attached to any pain as well. If an act does all these things, then it's definitely going to cause a lot of pleasure, and that's good. That's an act we want to do. Now, when you're answering an exam question, you don't need to know all of these exactly. There are ways you can remember this, but unless you get a 5-mark question specifically on this, which is not impossible, but it's not especially likely, don't worry about knowing and remembering all of these. If you're doing a 25-mark question and one of your points is criticising the hedonic calculus, you don't necessarily need to list down all of them. Listing down 2 or 3, explaining them well, is probably going to get you your marks. Especially in a 25-mark question, where only 5 of the marks are for what you know, and 20 of the marks are for how you evaluate what you know. Now that's Bentham's form. Mill, a bit later on, he comes with his own version. Now, Mill's version is qualitative, because it's not about the quantity of pleasure, it's not about how much, it's about what type of pleasure, the qualities of different pleasure, of different happiness. Okay, so intuitively, the idea that pushpin is equal to poetry isn't quite right, and this is where Mill builds from. So there seems to be something different from a simple game, from drinking alcohol in a warm bath, for example. That seems different to having an intellectual conversation, a philosophical conversation with a group of people you're really fond of. Like those two things are different in their pleasure. And Mill uses this idea. What he says is that we have higher pleasures and lower pleasures. And the higher pleasures are better. They're of better quality than the lower pleasures. Higher pleasures, what I mean by that is things which are broadly intellectual, things that sort of use the mind, things that get us to think about them. So we watch a film and then we really think about it. Oh, that was really interesting. What was the meaning behind this? Similar with a book or with some music or whatever it is. It's things that engage the mind, things that have some skill to them, like surfing or skiing or football or whatever it is. And this is actually really quite different to lower pleasures, which are merely just pleasures of the body. Mill not often, but it's often cited. He'd rather be a dissatisfied Socrates than a satisfied fool. So he'd rather be a human who wasn't very happy than maybe a pig, who he also cites, which is happy, it's eating, it's full, it's warm, it's running around in the mud. But that's clearly a different type of pleasure to the pleasure enjoyed by a human being. And so, how do we distinguish between what goes in higher and what goes in lower? So a competent judge is someone who has experienced both the higher and lower pleasures. They're educated, they're able to put different pleasures, and they're able to judge whether a pleasure is a higher pleasure, an intellectual pleasure, or a lower pleasure. And that's really important because we want to, when we're making rules, which we'll get onto in a second, we want to know whether we need to prioritise it. Is it a higher pleasure that's really important for all people, or a lower pleasure? Because the higher pleasures are judged above the lower pleasures. They're more important than, they're more desirable than lower pleasures. Now, Mill, I've said before, we have lots of different terms for the same idea. Now, one way we can also define Mill's version of utilitarianism is as a rule-based utilitarianism, or rule utilitarianism. So the reason is, Mill suggests at some points that we can form rules about our actions. So this is much simpler than going through a 7-step checklist before we do anything, trying to predict how much happiness an act will cause. A rule is better because it's set and forget. it's far more objective. Never murder or never steal is a rule we can form based on our experience that stealing always causes more pain, it maximises pain and minimises pleasure. And so we can form a strong rule that we must never break, that you shouldn't steal. But what about a hungry single mother with a child who hasn't eaten? What if she steals a bit of baby formula from a big supermarket, which is such a small thing, though it will feed her baby for a week and it will keep the baby nourished, and it will have no impact to the overall livelihood of the big supermarket, then maybe it might actually maximise pleasure. It might maximise the general happiness to steal. And so what you create then is a weak rule. So a weak rule you should follow all the time. Do not steal. But occasionally, in exceptional moral circumstances, you can break this rule. And so that's how we can form rules in utilitarianism. Now, Mill proves, or attempts at least to prove, the truth of utilitarianism. He argues that each person desires their own happiness. And, okay, I'll agree. Each person does desire their own happiness. And so, to me, my happiness is desirable for me. And for you, your happiness is desirable for you. And if it's true for both of us, then it must be true. We can induct that it's true for everyone. And so each person's happiness is desirable to them. And what this means is the general happiness of everyone is also desirable. Because what Mill argues is that my happiness is desirable to me, yours to you, everyone else to everyone else. And so we have this general desire towards general happiness. And what this means is Mill proves utilitarianism. He shows that it's true objectively. Every agent desires their own happiness. And this means that the hedonic principle of utility is true. In the next part of this video, we will look at the non-hedonic forms of utilitarianism. And then in the final part, we will look at all of the criticisms. There are a lot. So subscribe and like the video and look forward to that. Thank you for watching.